Today on the podcast, I'm talking with Molly Des Jardin about studying Japanese, Meiji-era literature, and Zenshu complete works collections. I was excited for this conversation because her writing on Zenshu really got me thinking about the role academic professionals and amateur fans like myself play in a writer's canonization, and our conversation about Japanese as spoken language gave me a perspective I don't think I'd ever had on that teaching method. Molly Des Jardin is a language and computer nerd who came to study Japanese and later book and media history of modern Japan almost by accident. She quickly got sucked into both for the long term and enjoyed the B-kyu adventures she got to have while working or studying in Fukuoka, Yokohama, and the least cool wards of Tokyo. Her PhD dissertation was a dive into how modern Zenshu got their start in the late 19th century, and she also published an article in the journal Book History on Saikaku's first Zenshu and his Meiji fanboys who made it happen. So, Molly, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
こちらこそよろしくお願いします。So, I came across your essay, Inventing Saikaku, when I was looking around the internet, and it got me so interested. I kind of have a fascination with Zenshu, and so I was very curious about your experience studying Japanese and how you kind of came to the point to write that essay, or that journal article. So the way I'm starting with everyone this season is with the very general question, how did you learn Japanese?
Yeah, so first of all, I would have to talk to anybody who sent me an email with the subject line, Zenshu fans unite. So you're got on my good side right away there. So I started taking Japanese as a freshman in college at the University of Pittsburgh, and it was a little by accident. I was interested in taking a foreign language, and I wanted to take Russian, but freshmen registered last, so that was full. And because I was a new computer science major and video game nerd, I, had an interest in Japanese from that angle anyway. So I ended up enrolling in first year Japanese, which at Pitt, unbeknownst to me, is a complete boot camp style program.
Huh.
It's 5 credits, but I think that's because that's the most any class could be. It was 7 hours a week of classroom time.
Wow.
2 lectures, and then the discussion section was every single day. The max class size was like 8 or 9 people, and it was only Japanese from day one. No books open and no notes being taken. Just speak. And it was a lot of drills. It's the Jordan Japanese as a spoken language textbook, at least it was then. So we just memorized and did conversations for an hour every single weekday. And nice. I think somebody broke down in class probably once a week, but it was a real, if you can put the effort into it, you will get so much out kind of experience. And I had so much fun that even though I wasn't a Japanese major and the CS program was also very time consuming, I just really loved that I got so much out of it if I was willing to put it in. So I just kept taking Japanese from there.
That's awesome. I mean, it's so funny. I did JSL too. That was kind of my entry into the language. And except I started with an intensive summer program, which I think, to be honest, is not ideal for JSL. I do feel like JSL is something that if you can pace it, even though that's a big load, when you're on a full academic year, it's still a big load. If you can pace it out over a little bit more than the 2 months during the summer and get those repetitions in, looking back, now that I can read and write a little bit better, it does make sense why you might start that way and then pair the written language with it afterwards.
Yeah, I actually did 3rd year at Middlebury, which also used JSL, but I think they had finished all of the textbooks and then just continued on with Middlebury instructor-made materials from 3rd year. And honestly, I think my Keigo and intonation were deceptively good in the interview because I probably shouldn't have been placed in that high of a level. But again, I got an award at the end of the Middlebury summer, Ichiban Ganbatta.
Oh, nice.
And I thought, I don't know how I feel about that. But you're more excited about it than I was. But at the same time, I definitely took the challenge to just throw myself into it because I was there for 9 weeks in the middle of nowhere just to speak Japanese. And I felt like that summer I got more out of that language wise than an entire year in Japan.
Oh, wow.
But again, if you like, it's not for everybody at every time in their life either. So you really have to be in the right spot to be able to give your all to that kind of experience. But I really felt like the first 2 years of Japanese at Pitt prepared me for that because it was already so intense. And I was so used to being wrong in front of other people every single day, just constantly. If you don't get over that right away, you won't get as much out of the language classroom. You have to produce language and be corrected constantly to learn anything.
Yeah, no, it's like you said, I think it will break you down a little bit, right? Like, so I'm curious to ask about Middlebury. That's you sign a pledge, right, where you won't use any English at all. Was that difficult? How did you find that experience?
Yeah, that it's 24/7 commitment to not just not speak English, but to only use Japanese. For listeners who aren't familiar with their intense summer programs. And you made me think of it because I remember meeting some classmates who were taking first year there. So they didn't know any Japanese and just dove into that very intensive program with the language pledge and with JSL, which felt a little crushing. A lot of them seemed to really be struggling more emotionally with the experience than necessarily intellectually, which when you said that doing the very beginning as an intensive program, it seemed like that was a common experience among people at first year Middlebury too. For me and the couple of good friends that I made in my class, also in third year, over that summer, we were okay with sticking to the language pledge. I think we all had a similar mentality of this is an opportunity that we probably won't get again. So let's give it our all because we're all really mostly here to learn Japanese more than anything else. But I think we were in the real minority among the people that I met there. Most people really needed more of a break or wanted to talk on the phone to their friends and family back home a lot in the evenings or weekends. And again, it's not making a judgment about, oh, some people weren't as committed. I think that really requires not just a certain personality, but a certain time in your life. I know I couldn't have done the Middlebury summer after, I think I went there at about age 20 or 21. I don't think I could have done it at any point in my life much after that.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, I can imagine it's a huge commitment, but yeah, one that I think probably committing to it brings results. And just thinking back on JSL a little bit, there are phrases from that first year textbook that are just stuck in my mind. Like I think in particular of "okiki shitain desu ga," like there was a video that we watched, and for whatever reason, that phrase like just will not leave my mind. And from there you can figure out how to turn that into "okugai shitain desu ga." All these other phrases become accessible once you start to remember those. Is there anything you remember from JSL that stands out when you think about Japanese?
It's funny that you say that some phrases stick in your head because I have a few and they're mostly from the restaurant role-playing scenes, and they're from when I was playing the role of the server in the restaurant. So things like, "Han ni nasaimasu ka?" something like that. Like, what kind of thing would you like? Would you like this alternative or this alternative? And I did a lot of eye rolling about that until I finally did go to Japan after I graduated from college on the JET program. And I was the only one around of the people in my JET friend group who could understand anything that people in convenience stores or McDonald's were saying to us for the most part. I've never had to really play the serving role in a Starbucks in Japan in real life, but I think I've been less frozen or intimidated by hearing the really formulaic keigo that you'll never hear or use anywhere else. But it's just a pattern that if you understand that kind of set phrase, at least it won't trip you up as much.
Yeah, it does. It starts to turn into more natural language the more you get exposed to it, I think, and especially if from an early time. I remember I was booking a JAL flight one time, and I was just asking all these questions, and they kept on saying "sayo de gozaimasu, sayo de gozaimasu," and I was like, "Wait,
That is
what?"
some JSL phrasing.
Yes, right. Like, and I was like, I know what that means, but I don't know why I know what that means. It was a very weird, funny experience. But yeah, no, it's interesting looking back. Like, it does seem like you're downloading just a huge amount of information through JSLs, especially if you read that. And that, yeah, I always wonder if there's some kind of medium between all Romaji and some kind of Japanese form of the textbook. But um, speaking of, like, written Japanese, when did that come in, and then what approaches to that do you think were effective for you? How did Pitt approach that, and then what was effective for you learning written Japanese and reading Japanese?
So, as you just said, due to JSL, again, for people listening who may not have used this system
Mm,
or encountered it, the textbooks for at least the first two academic years are written all in their own odd system of Romaji, and it
mm,
doesn't use any kana or kanji at all.
mm-hmm,
So I was really behind in terms of reading speed, definitely in terms of the number of kanji I could produce or recognize. And I think it was that summer at Middlebury when I just got thrown in the deep end in more ways than one into the language. And one of those big ways was that no Romaji was used. And I went cold from, we had started doing, I think Japanese as a written language is the counterpart where you
mm-hmm.
start learning some written Japanese, but not nearly as intensely as the spoken language with that system. And I was very slow and hesitant, and really, if compared to spoken Japanese, was very lacking. So it was very imbalanced. But I think having to suddenly read, and then also when I was taking notes in class, switching to kana and kanji where I knew them, it's really just that act of doing it all the time repetitively
Mm-hmm.
that stuck it in my head. And after that, several years later in graduate school, I went to the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Study,
Mm-hmm.
IUC, in Yokohama. And that's like a 10-month version of Middlebury for those who can endure it.
Mm.
And it's very focused on professional and academic language and writing. So I feel like their um, kanji kind of catching up to all of the Joyo kanji and then some system, which was basically do some every day on your own, memorize it, come in and take a quiz, basically, and then just being completely immersed in this very academic Japanese written environment, as well as speaking about written documents that we were using for homework, reading in class. It was really just a constant exposure and the need to do it, I think, more than deciding I was going to start really internalizing written Japanese. It was the need to do it at Middlebury that I just had no choice but to. I hate saying sink or swim because I feel like that's not a great expectation to give students, but it definitely was the case for me.
Sure, some kind of accountability, whether it's to yourself or to a program. I think that helps for sure.
Yeah, or I would say even more than accountability, it was either learn to take notes in Japanese or I will be doing it so slowly that I won't be able to catch up. So it
Mm.
was definitely necessity in the classroom, and it was mostly for me. Um, yeah, as I said, taking because we were allowed to take notes at Middlebury, unlike the Pitt classroom at first. So I suddenly needed to just internalize what I could so I could stay on top of things.
That's so interesting that they didn't let you take notes, at Pitt. I think looking back to my experience, there were times when during the drill sessions, we weren't able to take notes because it was just so quick, and you just kind of had to be there. I really vividly remember someone not really kind of understanding how the drill sessions were going to work. That they were just we had to memorize these conversations, and then like they were going to test us on them, and that was like literally one of the first days, and then after that it didn't happen again. But looking back, it does, like, it's so interesting to think about the language that way, because I mean the language is, you know totally separate from the written language, right? It's the written language is a representation of the language we actually use, right? So that's something I don't think I was able to think about as an undergrad. I don't think that's something that occurred to me.
Interestingly enough, so I discovered James Heisig's weird
Hmm.
kanji mnemonic storytelling for yourself kind of system.
Hmm.
The books are called Remembering the Kanji for those who haven't come across this before. I discovered that the first year that I lived in Japan. So again, after I graduated from college and already spoke well and was catching up on reading. And his system is explicitly divorced from classroom use. It's for doing it on your own. And it's very
Mm.
difficult because every classroom environment does want to do both. But
Hmm.
I think his points about adult learners of Japanese as a second language who haven't grown up in a kanji using culture
Hmm.
and are completely new to it, they're not learning kanji in the same way as a child would in
Hmm.
Japan or in any other country that uses them. So the expectation of just write it a bunch of times and memorize it that would work with a child isn't really the best way to go about it, especially when you have to learn 2,000 of them to be able to read a newspaper article or something. The efficiency just isn't really there. And I can understand why so many students would probably feel very frustrated that I certainly did after third year Japanese or more to feel like, oh, I still can't read a newspaper article, which is harder in Japanese than it is in English most of the time
Sure.
because of the level of writing is so much higher there. But I think his point stands. And I have a friend who is currently studying Mandarin Chinese just for fun as a hobby. And I recommended Heisig's book on Hansa to her,
Hmm.
and she took to it so well, loves it, is having tons of the same kind of weird, it's a challenge, but I'm getting something out of it, fun that I did with Japanese. And she's up to over 1,000 characters
Oh, that's
now, and she's
amazing.
only been doing it for about 6 months, just, alongside a full-time job and having a life. But she keeps emailing me. She's in the UK and emails me, oh, I'm still doing the Heisig book. This is great. I'm so glad you taught me about it. So I feel good that I'm not the only person who got something out of Heisig's system, but again, it's hard if you're studying Japanese in a classroom context, which I
Yeah.
think I would never have learned it if I hadn't been in an intense classroom context. It's hard to ask your language teachers, can you just wait for a few years on writing because I'm going to self-study with this weird system. In the meantime, they're probably not going to buy it. So
Yeah.
I think it is such a challenge, though, because spoken and written language, even though they come together at the end, can be really different
Hmm.
skills to acquire in terms of how it works best for people who aren't 5 years old.
Yeah. No, actually, I'm very curious to. It's funny. I've been thinking about Heisig and the kanji and everything because I'm actually about to go into IUC. I'm enrolling starting in September, so I've been
Oh, congratulations.
thanks, and I've been thinking about prepping for that, and I've started prepping some of the kanji, but it's coming at it from a weird point where I can basically read what I want to be able to read, and obviously look up words here and there, but I can't. I've forgotten how to write a lot of them, and so I'm looking into what's going to work for me, and Heisig is one of the things I've kind of been playing around with a little bit, but the Chicago Public Library unfortunately only has the second volume, so it doesn't have the first one where it teaches you the actual mnemonics. So I'm curious to ask about IUC, but it sounds like you went to Japan between undergrad and IUC. Is that correct?
Yes. So
And that was your first time there?
yeah, I didn't do study abroad, mostly for financial and practical reasons. Again, with doing the computer science major, it was an enormous number of credits, and any time I spent as a yugakse in Japan, I would lose that whole semester in terms of required
Hmm.
classes for that. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but it seems like exchange student programs, it's more in terms of content courses and
Yeah.
learning the language while you're there. But if you're not an Asian studies major, that can be really challenging
Sure.
to fit in. So I thought, why don't I finish my degree, and then instead of paying to go to Japan, I'll try to find some opportunity to be paid to go to Japan. And that
Sure.
got me into the JET program, as it gets everybody. Or so many people end up going to Japan for the first time that way, I think. I went to Fukuoka, which is at the like northern tip of Kyushu. So it was closer to Korea than Tokyo. And with that being my first experience there, I had no idea what was in that area. I had just no sense of it. It, of course, wasn't one of the requested places that I think JET mostly ignores. I fell in love with that area, though. It's still by far my favorite part of Japan is southern Japan. And it was a really like fun and interesting environment to be thrown in. I also learned from living there that Fukuoka has a lot of immigrant communities, including Koreans, other Asian populations, and a lot of Nikkei Brazilians and other South Americans. So people of Japanese descent who are Brazilian, Peruvian. I met a Colombian dance instructor who would come there for a year to do a dance residency. So it had a really international flavor, a lot of Spanish and Portuguese speakers around the nightlife with Latin American music to match. And also there is a large Marine base at Iwakuni and a Navy base at Sasebo, which I think are both about an hour away. And Fukuoka is the city that, of course, everyone would go to in that area to go out. So the nightlife was really vibrant with all these different groups of people. It felt very laid back. And it has a yatai food culture that like I think has gotten more popular in Japan since I was living there, but it's definitely a specialty of Fukuoka that you can just walk around the city on any given night and there are terrible smelling food stalls with the best food everywhere. I was told that the more someplace smells like an old sock, the better the ramen is, but I can't vouch for that necessarily, but it definitely had a really different atmosphere than when I later lived in Yokohama and Tokyo or northern Japan. Like the vibe felt very different when I later visited other parts of Japan.
Kyushu's great. You know, I loved Kyushu. I've been a couple different times. But I'm curious to know, what was the language like when you got there? So I know that you mentioned that you could understand the konbini keigo, but when you first arrived, how did it feel to be using this language you had spent so much time dedicated to actually in the country?
That's a good question. I am not sure what my expectations were at the time anymore because it was quite a while ago, but I think having the experience I had done the equivalent of 4 academic years of Japanese by that point. And I think having the experience of, as I put it, just being wrong in public by saying things in Japanese and being immediately corrected and saying moichido, like do it right by our sensei, who were a little harsh, but that's how you learn. Since I had already had that experience so much, and I am not too shy of a person, I think I was okay with knowing that I would keep making mistakes with Japanese that I produce, but I just wanted to finally get a chance to use it in real life and not a language classroom. And with Kyushu, people are pretty friendly. I think as the further south you go, there's more staring at gaijin. But because Fukuoka has so many different people from different places and a big mix of different languages, I remember feeling like I got stared at a lot more in Nagoya or Kyoto when I went up there to visit people than I ever did where I lived. So I think it did have that laid back attitude and a kind of friendly vibe that made using Japanese in real life finally not so intimidating.
Sure. And so you were an ALT or a CIR?
I was an ALT at a high school.
Okay. And how did you find teaching?
I think my jet experience was not great, even though I really enjoyed the area where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like the jet mantra of every situation is different applied so extremely well, even to just the few jets who lived in our teachers' housing apartment building, where several of us had been placed. So it was about 4 people mixed in with Japanese teachers and their families as well. And a friend of mine there taught almost every class period, every single day, because he was at a very high performing prefectural high school that was very serious about the English program. And my experience, I'll just say, was the complete opposite. I think the teachers at my school had maybe not necessarily been given a lot of support to change the curriculum to accommodate speaking time in class. And Japanese high school English classroom was actually pretty similar to my experience, quote unquote, learning French in high school here in the US, which was to listen about the language. In my case, listen about French in English and take multiple choice tests or take quizzes about grammar. It was very similar in the high school where I taught in Japan. So I really enjoyed getting to know the students. They were very sweet, and I wasn't too far from them in age either. And I hit it off with their dynamic, and they always wanted to come and talk to me. Once they found out I could speak Japanese, I was constantly having to yell at them to try English, but their English speaking level was very, very modest. So it was a real challenge for them to understand anything I was saying in English, even if they wanted to try speaking, unfortunately. But I think that situation, maybe not to the extreme that I was in, where I was mostly not being used in the classroom that often, it seems like you can get that whole range of experiences with jets. So unfortunately, mine was not on the great side of the experiences, but I'm not sure how my friend who taught in almost every single class period lived through that year either, because he was exhausted most of the time. So you have to be ready for whatever you're going to get with jet. Again, it's not just a certain kind of personality, but you have to be at a place in your life where you can accommodate that yourself and where it's worth it to you in exchange for the experience that you can get. So
yeah, I mean, I would have days where I would have 5 classes at elementary school and I would be exhausted by the end, but it was also very like this kind of satisfying exhaustion because I had control over the curriculum and was kind of doing what I wanted to do with the students. And then I'd have a day at the junior high school where they were all taking tests and it would just be empty, and would kind of had to just prepare stuff, or days when I would do one classroom at the junior high school, things like that. And then I had my other elementary school where it was 3 classes, and because there were only 20 students at this school combined from first grade to 6th grade. So it's such a range of different experiences, and I guess you just try and take it as you can and do the best you can. But yeah, overall, I think JET is definitely worthwhile applying. I always like to ask people, do you have any thoughts about the JET application process?
I found the application and the interview process to be just baffling. Unfortunately, I don't have any insight to share. I thought it was very strange, but now that I look back on it, to some extent, they're probably, at least from my interview experience, where I found some of the questions to be really off the wall or kind of out of nowhere. To some extent, I think they must be trying to see how well you think on your feet, or how much you can deal with rude or abrupt or kind of weird questions, because that's going to happen to you when you're in ALT for sure. Maybe not every day, but there are also cultural differences in Japan where asking somebody certain kinds of very direct personal questions, like, how old are you? Right? That's not especially a question that women get as much in American culture, but I felt like that was a question that just was immediate as soon as I got to Japan. But with a senpai kohai kind of relationship being really common there, it's something that people kind of need to know because they want to know how they should relate to you in some sense. So I think questions or comments about, I think, people's physical appearance are in some ways more common in Japan that would be considered rude here.
Yeah.
Comments about people's weight or size, you just have to be ready for whatever is going to be said to you when you go there, but also to stand up for yourself to some extent too, in a diplomatic way. So I felt like some of the questions I got asked in the interview, if I look back on it later, they probably showed how I would react to that kind of thing, but I'm not sure if that's why they asked them.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, I think, kind of going in, just being comfortable, not stressing too much, and then also, being able to react just kind of in a neutral way, good way. Like that's basically the best advice I think you can give. It does feel like they're a bit random because they vary based on the consulate or embassy you're applying through. So, and then
Right.
it's in terms of the comments about weight, I remember there was another jet in my town, and the woman who cleaned the Board of Education building one time just said, "Ah, skoshi futorimashita ne," to the woman, and she looked at me, and I was being forced to interpret this incredibly rude question, and so I said, "You filled out a bit," and
Oh, good thinking.
yeah, and she said, and later
I
on,
can't think of a better way to. Wow.
yeah,
Yeah, that's very awkward, but
yeah,
that is the kind of abrupt observation you might get in a workplace in Japan. So
yeah. She later thanked me. She was like, "Yeah, thank you for putting that in a delicate way." So. But I want to transition a little bit back towards reading Japanese. When do you remember like reading your first like novel, short story, something like that? And then what kind of training? Well, I'll do that first. Yeah, what was the first like? Do you remember the first like manga, short story book that you were able to read as a kind of entirety?
I think actually the first longer thing that I read on my own for enjoyment or because I wanted to finish it and not for a graduate school seminar, it was a Kakuta Michio novel.
Hmm.
The Woman on the Other Shore is the English title, but
This is Daniel with a quick correction here. Molly said that the author's name is Kakuta Mitsuyo, and I'll post a link in the blog post.
it wasn't new when I read it in Japanese, but it hadn't been translated into English yet. And that was when I was at IUC. So it was kind of, a ways into my Japanese learning adventures. But I think I had read more short story length things before and during JET. I remember reading Natsume Soseki's Yume Juya, which is the only thing I've read by him that I enjoyed, but it's creepy and weird, and it's not like his other novels, especially. It's it's supposed to be about 10 weird dreams that he had, and they all feel very vivid landscapes. They feel dreamlike to read them. They all feel like kind of a hard to understand but creepy dream that you've just woken up from. So I really enjoyed, especially the descriptive language that he used. I remember just sitting there and thinking about, oh, he describes these rice fields as aoi, as blue. And whereas an English speaker would, of course, call them green, and he may not have really even meant a blue-green because aoi and midori are kind of interchangeable to some extent, but it definitely added a certain nuance to reading about, I think that was like finding a baby in a rice field, or so. The whole scenario of the dream was very creepy. So somehow the descriptions of colors or the feeling of the air were very evocative for me. And I remember thinking, oh, this is like not just seeing the world in a different way because of different cultural reasons or because Japan uses keigo to express things in certain situations. It was really feeling like getting a different take on just what colors are the world because somebody is describing them in these ways that are normal in Japanese, but not jarring, but just more of a wake up for a non-native speaker to reconsider how would I describe this thing? Is blue really more like green than I thought it was. I've later
Mm.
learned that that's not unique to Japanese, that
Hmm.
many languages don't differentiate between them or have more colors for blue than English does. Like Russian has a lot of variations on blue, but even those small elements like that make language learning so satisfying if you're somebody who enjoys like writing and the arts. I think because it can even change your perspective on those kind of things. You feel like I'm looking at it with the same eyes, but now I can see it a little differently because I have different language to do it with.
Very cool. So does Natsume Soseki qualify as Meiji era writing? That's the other question I'm curious to ask.
Yeah, he is now the famous
Okay.
Meiji writer. I mean, he's a famous, very famous writer, regardless. But the best-selling writer of the Meiji period, Ozaki Koyo, was very popular, but he's barely read now.
Okay.
Barely on Aosoro Bunko. So it's interesting to see that after really diving headfirst into Meiji literature later in my PhD, Soseki was well known and important then too, but it's interesting to see how that landscape of who gets remembered as a canonical figure or outsized importance can be really different 100 years later from who was moving the most books or getting published as a serialized novelist the most at the time.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean that kind of leads right into I've had conversations with this about this with people on Twitter about how Natsume Soseki, he feels relatively easy to read if you read some of his writing. Obviously there are a few things that are different here and there, but other Meiji era writing is not quite as easy, and maybe that's because he eventually won out. He was, in terms of it became canon, lasted a little bit longer than some of these other writers. What kind of skills do you need to read other Meiji era writing, or even Soseki? Do you think are those different than reading something more modern, like a contemporary
Yeah,
novel?
it's extremely different, and unfortunately, I got this question from grad students after I had done my PhD and was working as a librarian. The grad students at my institution who knew I was a Meiji specialist often asked me for advice. And I both like to see that they're studying Meiji and was so frustrated by this question because there are just very few to no resources in terms of textbooks, tutorials, things like that that I am aware of myself. And I really wished that I could have had some better explainer when I was learning to do this. But also the downside of Meiji writing, the upside of Meiji writing is that it's very dynamic. There's a lot of experimentation going on. There are loan words coming into the language. Every writer at the time, especially literary writers, were deciding what modern Kindai, Meiji period, written Japanese would be. They were trying to figure that out for themselves, like bring it into the modern Western influenced world. But that meant that every, again, especially literary writer that you read, they have their own, not just completely different style, but their own grammar. They make up their own kanji words that you'll
Hmm.
spend 3 hours looking for
Mm.
in like Morohashi or some like very expert dictionary, and then eventually realize that it's not in the dictionary because they coined it themselves
Hmm.
right then. So it's very difficult to give any advice that isn't really specific to each author, and it makes it difficult to even start getting into yourself. I think the theme, I guess, of my Japanese language learning that's coming out here is being thrown in the deep end and just
Hmm.
either do it or get out.
Hmm.
And that's really how I started reading Meiji novels, short stories, like so literary material like that, and essays, was by taking graduate school seminars where from the first week, oh, here's your first novel, read it in a week, and it was published in 1895
Wow.
or
Yeah.
something. And I am eternally grateful for some advice I got offhand from a graduate student who was about to be done with the PhD program when I first showed up there at University of Michigan. He said, if you can get like 15 or 20% of any novel, like you're doing great. Don't expect to get more than that. And I think it would have been a lot easier to feel like I wasn't, I don't want to say good enough, but that my language skill wasn't good enough for me to be in a program reading these kind of documents from day one. And I think if you don't have at least some sense of confidence and also realism about how much you'll be able to do without a ton of experience, I think it would have been easy for me to feel like I'm never going to get it. I should give up and do something else. But having that little tidbit and knowing, okay, if I can read like or understand 15% of what's going on in this novel, I'm doing pretty good. Even if that wasn't something that our professor said to us, it helped me a lot. And over time, the more I read and puzzled through these different authors, I just started seeing commonalities in terms of grammar quirks. Like there's some things that are kind of based on kanbun. There's some things that are based on various kinds of bungo, like classical Japanese. Some of the orthography is different. And by that, I mean hentagana, different forms of kana that were used at the time, whether handwritten or in typeset printing, like in a newspaper or magazine, and different forms of kanji. Also words that we use now, like kono, kore, sore, that aren't written in kanji now, were written in kanji then, mostly. But depending on the author, people are being very playful, and it makes that era of writing really, really interesting to read. And it's very rich and interesting language, but it's definitely a challenge. And unfortunately, again, not just because of lack of resources, but it really depends on what you're reading. If you're reading a bunch of legal documents or a newspaper, that's totally different from reading any of a whole array of individual novelists who all have their own style, ranging from a writer like Higuchi Ichio, who wrote in a very classical Japanese style, modernized, but very, very much you'll benefit from knowing classical grammar really well to read her. And you could go from that to Mori Ogai, who threw German loanwords all through his writing and didn't translate half of them, or would gloss kanji words that he made up with German terms that were what he was translating from. So it really runs the gamut.
Yeah.
At that time. It's interesting that you say that Soseki is easier to read for somebody who reads modern Japanese, because a lot of these variations on language were part of a movement called Genbun Ichi that basically meant unifying spoken and written language. And it was a big movement for intellectuals at the time who wanted to argue about what is the best way to do written Japanese and standardize it. And you have people trying to make the case for their own way by writing in that style that they think is best. And I believe, I hope I'm not misspeaking here, but I believe our now standard da or dearu type of direct writing style came out of the author of the novel Ukigumo, or Floating Clouds. His name was Futabade Shime. And he only wrote that novel and published it in the late 1880s. That's how recent that writing style is. And it didn't, take on uniformly right then. It took until the early 20th century for that to become even remotely standard. And meanwhile, another author I remember reading and finding by far the easiest to read was a now kind of unknown guy named Yamada Bimyo, but he was really into writing in mas and des style.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Which, if you study Japanese using JSL, you will default to mas form, which I think is safe and good, rather than defaulting to something more direct. But he thought that kind of spoken language was more natural to read, and he wrote not just dialogue, but all of his prose in des mas form. Is very readable to somebody now who's used to that style with spoken Japanese.
I'll have to check that out. That's so curious. I'm glad you mentioned the des mas thing. That's so true for a JSL student. And then I was also going to say the orthography thing is so interesting because, I mean, sometimes your brain puts up these roadblocks and you kind of resist wanting to be able to recognize this new style, this new form. But if you kind of like are open to it, it becomes pretty, you can pick it up pretty easy, I think, by, like you said, jumping in the deep end and just kind of like exposing to it, being confident that, okay, this is something I will be able to access at least some of.
Right. And if you're trying to dive in to Meiji writing, especially literary writing, this ties into the subject of the email you sent me about Zen Shu. But a lot of what the ways that you'll access that writing now, you may not encounter that different orthography unless you really dig for it. Because by and large, especially in a classroom, like in a seminar in graduate school or in Japan at a university, you would be reading late 1800s, early 1900s writing from a Zenshu reprint that was published in the early 2000s or in the 90s, probably 1990s, not 1890s. So the orthography has often been standardized to modern Japanese in those kind of reprints. The downside is that in the Meiji period, in the original newspaper serialization of a lot of what we consider just standalone book novels now, many newspapers glossed all kanji because many Japanese people were new to reading kanji at that time, or at least in the way they were being standardized and used in Meiji newspapers. So especially the newspapers that were aimed at not the elite readers, more the everyday reader, the masses, they often glossed all the kanji. But in the Zenshu that are printed now, being able to read the Joyo standard kanji without glosses is expected, so sometimes they get dropped from
Wait, gloss,
reprints.
do you mean furigana?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
got
so
it.
pronunciation gloss typically, but in the Meiji period, people could gloss a kanji word with the pronunciation of a different but related word too. So it wasn't just a guide, it was also a way for writers to add almost a footnote or an added nuance without having to explain it out in something like a footnote, which you wouldn't want in a novel necessarily. In terms of modern writing, that it's not similar to Meiji language itself, but it does something similar with glossing a kanji word with furigana that's from a different word and adds meaning.
Yeah.
The manga Death Note does that a lot. So if people who don't really want to invest in learning Meiji language want to get a taste of that kind of language play, I know that there are other manga or probably prose fiction now that still plays with language in the same way. But I remember when I first read a volume of Death Note more than 10 years ago, I was surprised to see that author doing something very similar with adding meaning, but in these kind of subtle ways that don't require a whole explanation, just kind of like a hint as you're reading.
Got it. Yeah, I've seen that in Murakami before, where he's got some kind of kanji compound, but it's pronounced with some kind of Western word, so he puts something totally different over it. That's interesting.
Exactly. So when you reprint something and you have to make a choice about, will I take the furigana, the gloss, or it's also known as ruby, if you decide to remove that, depending on whether it was just a assistance for the reader because they didn't know how to pronounce the kanji, or if it was added linguistic meaning, you're really making a choice about whether to keep them in and have all of the very richness of the Meiji language, but that might be more than a casual reader now really wants on their page, versus taking it out, but maybe really not just losing the context, but the meaning of what was written 100 years ago. It's always a choice. So you can see why I was so interested in Zenshu once I realized how I shouldn't say pervasive, it sounds bad, but how common they are as a way to access literature. They're the first thing you might reach for, and they're considered the most authoritative thing
Yeah, so I
too,
mean,
like the best source to go to. But it makes you stop and think. It's not that Zenshu are making some kind of sinister choice about hiding or erasing language, but every reprint, every step you get away from a first edition or a newspaper serialization has to make choices like that.
yeah, there's decisions being made, and I'm glad we're gotten to Zenshu finally. It took us a little while, but I'm really fascinated with Zenshu and also with the journal article I came across for a couple of reasons. Well, one is I came across them, looking at different writers when I was studying abroad, but then also the Murakami Zenshu. So Zenshu, for anybody who's not familiar with them, are complete works. That's literally the translation, and they're kind of these publications of just vast collections of the writer's writings. But as you've kind of suggested, there's decisions being made about what's being included and how to represent that writing. So I'm really interested in Zenshu, but also as an undergrad, I struggled developing paper topics and a thesis topic. So I'm curious to know how you got into that topic, because when I read that essay, it felt very like complete as a topic, but then also you later mentioned to me that it was a piece of your dissertation. Could you mention a little bit how you got into it, and then how you kind of conceptualized that? Where did you get into it through Saikaku, who's the author that was of the first Zenshu, or did you get into it from Zenshu in general? How did that go?
Yeah, so I think my answer for how I came up with the topic would be frustrating to past me when I had first come to grad school, because as you mentioned, you can sometimes struggle coming up with paper topics, or, for something as big as a dissertation, that's even more intimidating. And I had the same issue. And when I came to my PhD program, I didn't have a solid thing that I was really committed to working on right when I entered the program. As time went on, I kept feeling like I'm never going to think of anything. How can I come up with a whole project idea? And the few other students who were around at the time who were farther along than me all kept saying, it'll just come to you. Don't worry about it. And I was so frustrated by that. It's not very good advice. Like, you can't act on that. But that's basically what happened in the end. So they were right. It came to me through a very random kind of coincidence. So I was in a seminar just about the year 1889. And we were reading, all kinds of mostly works of literature that were published that year in Japanese. And as a side project, our professor had assigned each of us students to alternate weeks of reading Yomiuri Shimbun from 1889 for the month that corresponded to our week. So the first week one was January, and a colleague of mine found an essay that we were reading from a Zenshu in class in Yomiuri Shimbun, and he made copies of it for all of us, just kind of as a novelty. Oh, I found it. Look at that. It was on the front page of one issue in January. But then we looked and the title was different. And then we looked a little more and the text was different too. It wasn't a totally different topic, but it had been heavily revised and edited before it ended up somehow in his Zenshu, Mori Ogai's Zenshu from the 1970s. So I couldn't stop thinking about that afterwards, not so much, again, to say, oh, something sinister is going on here. Oh, I found this one instance where something got changed. It really made me take a step back and think, wait, why are we looking in Zenshu for everything? To begin with, everything that we read in seminars, and I think it's a common experience, was photocopied or scanned out of Zenshu. And then I kept wondering, how did that essay get changed and ended up in there? And then if we're only looking at these later editions, how can we really make very many statements about what readers in 1889 were reacting to? It's not just decontextualized, it also is a different essay than what was published then. So I kept thinking about it more and more, and I really thought, okay, I want to pick some case studies and just get a little closer to the question of, where did Zenshu come from and why did they become so ubiquitous? Why are we using them for everything now? And I was surprised myself that I found what I would call as the first kind of modern individual author Zenshu.
Mm-hmm.
It was only in the mid 1890s. They're not that old as a kind of institution or as a thing that you assume every author will have, and it'll have their name. Like Higuchi Ichio, I would argue, is really the archetype of these, and the first one of the type that has gone on to become very common. Her name, Ichio Zenshu, and it's got, maybe the first edition of hers, it didn't necessarily have everything in chronological order, but you have some expectations now of what you'll find when you open up an author Zenshu. It's like a standard kind of format. And if the author is famous enough, you expect to be able to find it.
Yeah.
But hers was only published in 1897. So that blew my mind that I could find the first one, and that, of course it's drawing on other cultural institutions in terms of print books, like the types of things that people were used to being able to buy in a bookstore would turn to for scholarship in the Meiji period. So it didn't come out of nowhere. So it had influences from China, from Chinese culture, classical Chinese writing, from things like Charles Dickens's complete works was popular in the West, and even Japanese writers at the time who were bestsellers in Japan, they were reading and sometimes adapting current Western novelists who they liked. So that wouldn't have been too big of a stretch for people to say, oh, hey, this very well-known author has just passed away. We should make a Zenshu of her works, because that's what you do. But somebody had to do it first. And that is the case for Higuchi Ichio, who I don't think would have been on the 5,000 yen bill now, soon to be kicked off of it. But I don't think she would have become like this legendary cultural figure, and enough of kind of a literary piece of Japanese literary heritage to end up on the actual money 100 years after she died, without her friends and colleagues promoting her in this way that made it very easy for current fans and also people who were interested in her. She died very young in 1896, and it was kind of a celebrity death almost in the newspapers at the time. So it was really part of this whole maybe perfect moment where these influences could all come together, and it would make a lot of financial sense for somebody to publish a Zenshu of her works. It went through more than 30 printings in the following less than 20 years before her second edition was published. So clearly it caught on, and like everybody who passed away right after her as well in the literary world, their friends put together a Zenshu for them. And it seems to have just continued on until now, even if the context now is they're much more kind of scholarly, academic, authoritative, not bestsellers for the mass media market, which they were early on in the Meiji period.
Yeah, I mean, that's, oh man, that's so interesting. And I think the way you kind of, the kind of conclusion you come to at the end of the journal article I read was so interesting in terms of like, these are fans kind of participating in this fan culture to a certain extent and creating this writer that didn't exist previously. And I think it's especially interesting because, I was coming at it from a Murakami point of view where he's publishing his own Zenshu. So has very much control over how he's going to be perceived through this Zenshu. And, it's including some things and not including other things. There's stories that he has called a failure, and that he doesn't include any of his short story collections or the Zenshu, it doesn't include his nonfiction writing. Whereas a lot of these other Zenshu try to be more completionist. And then, you have Murakami fans actually who are kind of cataloging his publications on the internet. There was a guy who was doing it for a while. His site is down, unfortunately, but I was able to save a copy, and you can find it on archive.org. I think I can probably link that. But it's got all these very interesting essays and pieces of writing that I mean, if you go to the National Diet Library, you can request and get a copy of. Which reminds me, is Meiji writing? Were you able to access actual Meiji writing, like the Saikaku Zenshu or the Ichiyo Zenshu, when you were doing your studies? And was that through something like the National Diet Library?
Yeah, I was able to access it depending on the resource I was trying to get. Sometimes I had to get a little creative about it because that time period was really when more like industrial printing and mass media was starting to happen in Japan, like post Meiji Restoration, not just through the importing of technology, but in the Edo period, things like newspapers, magazines, it was all not nearly as much of like a free environment that people could start their own publications. And so I think there was a real, just tons of stuff being printed and sold. It's not the kind of stuff that is old enough to be considered special, rare collections that has to be like carefully preserved as is. But it's also kind of ephemeral, like old newspapers and magazines that are a little moldy, and like even if somebody has them still, they're moldy. They've been rebound in that really tough library binding, maybe, or they were just thrown out, not retained. Or in the case of the National Diet Library, a lot of their older digital versions of things that were in their very first version of their digital collections, those were scanned from microfilm. So they're not the greatest digital copies, I would say, to begin with. But when you have so many steps away from it, quote, original, that may be kind of a decaying newspaper from the 1880s, and then you microfilm it, maybe not in the best quality, and then scan it from there, as you get all those steps away from even a thing that might not photograph that well to begin with, it can be a real challenge to just figure out what that splotchy looking kanji on the pages sometimes.
Oh, wow.
Because like even just the reproductions of things may not be that great. It's kind of I don't want to call it a sweet spot. It's the opposite of that, a bitter spot of things that were not important enough to save, but now they're old enough that it's hard to find them sometimes.
Sure.
Yeah, so I didn't really use the National Diet Library because I learned by going there in person that a lot of the things I thought I could look at the book instead of a scanned microfilm, they really just have the microfilm there too. So I went to the Museum of Modern Japanese Literature in Meguro-ku to finally find an original of the Ichiyo Zenshu that I was really wanted to see what the cover looked like. It was bound in Japanese style binding. It had like this very traditional Japanese look to it. So I really wanted to be able to handle it in person. But Saikaku was interesting. I think it was collected and saved by enough libraries, or enough copies had been printed and sold, that I found multiple copies of it. Apparently there was censorship in the Meiji period for like dirty parts of Saikaku's stories. So sometimes I would find, and just as I was flipping through this always rebound and library binding book, I would see there was a half a line that was just all maru, 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 like an empty circle, where it was like putting blackout over the, whatever words that shouldn't be printed in the Meiji period. And every single copy, some reader long ago had written in the original line in pencil over the marus. Yeah. Yeah. Readers took it into their own hands at some point. I would kill to know who those people were, but of course
the original like Aozora Bunko so people, funny. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's fascinating. So when you're getting access to these original copies, were you allowed to take pictures, or was it, I can't remember what the protocols are at the National Diet Library, but I remember it was relatively strict. Like, I don't think you were allowed to bring in cameras.
Yeah, so I did my dissertation research in 2009 and 2010. At that time, I can't speak for NDL because I didn't visit too often, but I went to a bunch of different university libraries, both my own institution that I was affiliated with, Nihon Daigaku. And then I went to Todai's library as well, Tokyo University. You can enter there without being affiliated,
Cool.
just by showing them your ID. So depending on what places were accessible to somebody who didn't want to get a lot of introduction letters, like that kind of, that and the collections led me to where I went. None of those places allowed cameras, which struck me as so, again, it's so strange, but it's just a different culture, different way of doing things. You just have to roll with it. But there were always photocopiers. I felt like I spent so much money photocopying, and then I had to mail all these boxes of photocopies back to myself in the US over surface mail, funabin. So it took a couple of months, but was much cheaper. But I remember regretting that I had mailed them all and then was waiting with great anticipation for them to show up and hoping nothing got waylaid. That was a stressful couple of months waiting. But I wonder now, because that was a while ago, I wonder if library policies have changed more recently to maybe get away from the photocopies. But I made a lot of A3, the really large size of paper photocopies, and then didn't know what to do with them in the US. So that size of paper isn't really normal for offices here.
It's hard.
Yeah, it created some challenges, like when I wanted to try to scan some things later to save it on my computer. But
yeah, I definitely spent several $100s on copies at the National Diet Library when I was going for this kind of Murakami ephemera. And at the time, it was right around that same time. It would have been 2008, 9, 10 range. And it was pre-iPhone, but digital cameras were everywhere. I don't think those were allowed. But yeah, you couldn't, I don't think you can make copies yourself. You had to request them. And you request like very specific pages. And I do remember I was able to kind of do that online too. I remember I lost this one story. I misplaced it but was able to kind of request it, and they ended up sending it to me. So that's also something available if people are looking for something like that. There might be a service that could do that for you. But well, this was really fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. I think we're just over an hour now. I did want to ask you, I know you have an interest in Haikyo, and one, I don't want to get too deep into it, but I'm very curious about Haikyo etiquette. Is there an established etiquette for visiting Haikyo? Haikyo are ruins of old buildings, a lot of them from the kind of bubble era and things like that. What's your experience been visiting Haikyo, and what's the Haikyo etiquette like?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I am not qualified to answer etiquette questions because I have been more into the kind of photo books, and it's like Instagram accounts, because it's 10 years after I first got into the Haikyo boom in Japanese publishing culture. But I am a big fan of the weird zines and muku, like magazine book, MOOK combination that are so popular in Japanese bookstores. Kind of a glossy, extra long magazine issue about a thing. There, since I want to say like 2006, 2007, has just been this explosion in cool photography books of first Haikyo ruins, these like abandoned places. But as time went on, it really expanded to all kinds of related things like infrastructure, dams, like in rivers. Dam mania is, I think, maybe overstating it, but there's more than one book out there alleging dam mania. Taking pictures of factories at night in places like Kawasaki, between Tokyo and Yokohama, that has like a bay with a bunch of factories that, look cool at night. There's also this related idea of B-kyu, like B grade, or kind of like a B movie, right?
Yeah.
B-kyu gurume, like food, like curry rice and stuff like that, or B-kyu spotto, chin spotto, so like places you can go that are kind of B grade. That all seems to be kind of related phenomena. And also danchi, like the large, old kind of public apartment complexes that were built from the 60s through like the 90s. In Japan, they can often look like a company town, kind of large apartment buildings that had their own amenities, their own konbini or hair salon or whatnot, playgrounds, stuff like that. So it seems like photographers really love to just take photos of all of these interesting, mundane, like not exactly tourist sites, but it's becoming a tourism industry. I think Gunkanjima, the battleship island off the coast of Nagasaki, has got to be the most famous one. And when I last lived in Japan, that was like off limits still technically, although you could go to Nagasaki and hire or, pay off a local fisherman to take you there on his boat. So it wasn't being guarded or anything. But now there are cruises that go there, very short cruises, because it's just kind of off the coast, but you can pay to go on a kind of a supervised tour of this abandoned coal mining operation and all of the apartment complexes of the workers and their families who used to live there on the island and work there. And now you can go and take pictures. So I think when you ask about etiquette, I think it really depends on, is this a sanctioned tourist site or not? Some of them you can go online and book a tour, and others you maybe have to sneak around a little more. But it doesn't seem like these sites are really guarded or have fencing up or anything like you might expect them to in the U.S. more. And if it's a B-kyu gurume, it might just be a diner on the side of the road in some rural prefecture where you can get really good curry or something. So depends on what you're after.
Nice. Yeah. Do you have any favorite bookstores in Japan for these MOOCs?
If you're in Tokyo and you're near Ikebukuro, it's one of the largest bookstores in Japan physically. It's called Junkudo, and that's kind of my favorite weird bookstore chain. It's pretty mainstream, but they have a lot of unusual things there. I would say more than Maruzen or Kinokuniya, they're more likely to have one copy each of a bigger variety of things instead of many copies of a few more popular things. And it's a 10-story. Yeah. It's their flagship store. I used to love to go in there when I lived nearby, but for haikyo and factories at night and zines, I mean, honestly, it had become popular enough that I remember seeing fun displays that bookstore employees had made of this kind of publication, even at Tsutaya in Yokohama near a mall or something. It really seemed to catch on. So I think if you're in Japan and want to enjoy looking at all this strange photography or B-kyu recommendations, you should probably be able to find it pretty easily. One specific recommendation I'll make for a title is a magazine called Wonder Japan. They used to be called Wonder Japan, Japan. That stopped publication in 2012, but somebody picked it back up again and relaunched it with JAPON. Slightly different, but you could read it as wander, like wander around, or wonder, like wonderful, strange things that you can find in Japan. And it covers just all kinds of weird, abandoned, or just kind of lame or forgotten tourist sites, and people write B-kyu, gurume, or other kinds of columns in there. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's got a fun vibe. And that, since it's been relaunched, you should be able to find it in a bookstore in Japan now.
It sounds like a B-kyu version of like the Walker magazines that you see everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, only it covers the whole country. Yeah. So it's less specific to one place, but they've also done some international special issues too, finding all of the giant weird Buddha's elbows in Asia, or they'll pick kind of one little element of strange old sculpture and just go find examples of it everywhere.
Nice. I've been to that Junkudo, by the way, on the recommendation of this other former Jet, Matt Trevod, who's online writer, translator. Yeah, that's a great bookstore. There's just so much stuff there, and they'll have all the literary magazines too, the ones that are maybe a little bit difficult to find at the regular bookstore. So that's a great recommendation.
Yeah, just watch your wallet when you walk
Oh
in.
yeah,
If you're anything like me, it's very dangerous, even though it's fun.
yeah, danger for tsundoku enthusiasts for sure. Well, great. Yeah. So at the end, there's three questions I like to ask everyone. The first is, do you have a favorite kind of onigiri?
Yes, umeboshi.
Okay, excellent. And do you have a go-to Japanese karaoke song?
I don't. I'm really bad at karaoke, so I always try to avoid it in Japan.
Fair enough.
Sorry. I was
Uh,
told that I hate fun because of this, but we
oh
can't all
no.
be
I
perfect.
think it sounds like you have plenty of fun, just literary fun for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And then finally, what's something you remember from your very first week in Japan?
I remember coming to my new jet apartment, and the person who took me there was an office lady at my school who didn't speak English at all, so got to use the Japanese. And I was trying to ask her if Japan has something like Tupperware, and I didn't know how to say it. So I was describing, like, it's the thing that you can save food in, and it's plastic. And she said, "Oh, do you mean tappa?" And
Mm,
I started laughing, and she looked at me funny, and I said it's the exact same word in English. And she also thought it was really funny. So I remember having that kind of break the ice moment with somebody kind of laughing over language questions, which was definitely a theme of the year.
great. Yeah, that's a really memorable conversation. That's so funny.
I think being able to laugh at your mistakes or kind of questions that you think afterwards were kind of dumb, being able to laugh about them in front of the person you're asking does a lot to give you the goodwill and break the ice too. So definitely a lesson there that I use the whole rest of the year.
Yes. Well, thanks again, and thanks so much for your patience. Omatase shimashita. Hontoni, I know that I got in touch with you initially, like 2019, I think, right after I was finishing up the first season of the podcast, and it took us a little while to get this on the books, but really fascinating, so interesting. I'll put up some links to what we can to some of your work, and really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, it was so nice to finally be able to chat with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. You can find How to Japanese on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Substack. And we'll see you next week. それではまた来週.